I'm Deb Bailey, and on behalf of the Partnership for a Drug-Free Hall, welcome to our 5th in the series of Not My Family. Many of you I have seen before, so welcome back. For those of you that this is your first time here, we hope you'll find that your time this evening is well spent and that you go away much more educated about vaping. Vaping is our topic tonight, and it's a very timely one because just yesterday we lost the second person in Georgia to vaping, and now over 20 in the United States. Yesterday, Governor Kemp issued a public health advisory on the risk of vaping and the use of e-cigarettes. And just last week, the Center for Disease Control issued a public health alert. The American Cancer Society just reported a 900% increase in vaping in high school students in the last couple of years. To put that in context, let's think. 20 people have died, many in the hospital, but also last week, a couple of weeks ago, Zantac, the heartburn drug, was taken off the shelves because they think it might have a small ingredient that may be linked to cancer. We all know that if romaine lettuce kills someone or hurts someone, it would be taken off the shelf by the time that we left here tonight. However, since those same protective organizations are not protecting you and your family, thank you, Judy, we feel an obligation to provide you with the facts so you can protect yourself and your family. We have an all-star lineup, beginning with Larissa Batron from the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse. And she's going to give you some of the latest updates. Like I said, this is our 5th in a series. And she's going to give you a short update on some of the programs that we've had before and what we are seeing. Following Larissa, Jay Parrish and Brian Majors, Jay the Chief of Police and Brian the investigator from the Gainesville Police Department, are going to tell you what they're seeing on our streets and in our neighborhood. Then, backed by popular demand, Dr. Merrill Norton, clinical and associate professor at UGA, is going to speak to you on the dangers associated with vaping. Then Adam Rollerson from Laurelwood, a licensed marriage and family therapist, will guide us and you at your tables on how to tackle the tough questions that we have on these issues around vaping and other addictive drugs. And Judy Brownell from Centerpoint will come up and tell you at the end what's next. So I would like to now, well, let me say one other thing I'm supposed to tell you. We're going to keep our questions until the very end because we want to be very respectful of your time. So at the very end, we'll have questions. You can write those questions on your cards. We'll pick them up and then we'll try to answer them. And our speakers have said that they would stay around a few minutes after the program is over for very specific questions. So let's now welcome Larissa. And as she comes up, she has given me permission to tell you that today is her 5-year sobriety birthday. In 12-step traditions, individuals mark time in recovery, not just to show their individual progress, but also to show others that it's possible. The most generous thing that someone in 12-step recovery can do is to share the amount of time since they picked up their last drink or drug. Larissa is generously and humbly sharing her anniversary date with us so we can honor her, but also for us to see that there is hope and that recovery is a reality. Larissa.
So as Deb said, my name is Larissa Barthen, and I'm a person in long-term recovery, and also what that means to me is that it's been 5 years since I've used any drugs or alcohol. And due to my recovery, I have the opportunity to give back today. I show up for my family, I show up for my friends. My mom lets me come stay at her house and watch her dogs when she's not there. They trust me again. And that's all completely due to my recovery. I also, I speak out about my recovery because I want everybody to know that recovery isn't just the exception, but it's the expectation. And along with that, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Northeast Georgia Community Connections Program. So this is run through the partnership between the Georgia Council on Substance Abuse and Northeast Georgia Hospital System. So at Georgia Council on Substance Abuse, we do 4 things: education, advocacy, training, and peer recovery support services. And in November of 2007, we officially launched the peer program within Northeast Georgia Hospital System in the Gainesville, Brazelton, and Winder campuses. And I've got to tell you, since doing this, we've gone to a number of different hospitals, because many hospitals are interested in implementing a similar program. And the conversations that we have with the staff at these hospitals just genuinely makes us appreciate how far ahead the culture at Northeast Georgia Hospital System is. So they have a culture now that's supportive of people in recovery, encourages people into finding recovery, and really embraces the program. So we are thoroughly grateful for that partnership. So what it is, though, is peer support in hospital settings. So we foster trust with not just the peers, the individuals that we see, but also the medical staff and the community as a whole. So when somebody comes to the emergency department for any kind of substance use related issue, whether it be challenges with their liver due to alcoholism or an overdose from opiates, we actually see them inside the hospital bedside. So the goal with that, the support that we offer, is to provide compassionate, self-directed care. So in my recovery, when I first started recovery, I didn't need somebody to tell me everything that I needed to do. I needed somebody to help me find my pathway to recovery, and that's really what our coaches do. And we promote long-term recovery for every individual that we encounter. And a goal of that promotion of recovery is getting them connected within the community. So we aren't the be-all, end-all answer of all the challenges that person faces, but the community is. So how do we get them connected within the community so that they can find recovery? We also provide support for families and friends. Many people come without their families there at the time, but many people also come with their families there. So it's a really, really difficult time for parents if their child just overdosed and they are kind of shaken and don't know what to do. So we provide peer support to the family members as well. And with that program, with the success of that program, the NICU also started from there. So Northeast Georgia Hospital System, they started a neonatal abstinence syndrome task force. And that was done completely by the hospital staff, and they heard about what was happening in the emergency department with peer support and asked if we can start doing a similar program within the NICU. So we also provide peer support to mothers that either have had a baby born with NAS or pregnant mothers from the community that have the potential to have a baby born with NAS or some kind of withdrawal symptom. So a little bit about what the process looks like. Somebody enters the emergency department and they get medically cleared by the Laurelwood staff, the behavioral health unit at the hospital. And then our peer recovery coach comes in and provides that support to the individual. And again, the goal is just making that connection with the person. So not necessarily telling them they need to go to treatment, but making that connection and forming a relationship with the individual. Because a lot of times when people come in, everybody else has kind of given up at that point. So our coaches are really there to be that one person that's going to say, I'm not giving up on you. I'm here and I care. And So after they leave the emergency department, we continue to provide follow-up support through telephone or text or social media or however they'll respond, but that goes on until they tell us that they don't need that anymore. And so this is some of the data that we've seen since January of 2018 to September of 2019. And to date, we've seen at the beginning of this month, it was 3,261 individuals in the emergency department. And we hear a lot about the opioid crisis and opiates, but there's also, what we notice is there is a much bigger issue with alcohol and methamphetamines. So alcohol is right about 1,600, and that's just from January to September, 1,600 people. So there's a lot of reasons for that, and we won't go into those for the sake of this, but and then methamphetamine is second at about 800. And so the NICU process is fairly similar. It has some differences, but when a mother comes to the NICU and they have a baby that's born in withdrawals from opiates or any kind of substance, our coaches come down and actually visit with the mom and talk with the mom. And when they have a baby born with NAS, the baby can be there anywhere from a couple of days up to 6 weeks or sometimes even longer. So the coaches continue to see them every single day that they're there. And again, the same concept of making that connection and providing support to the mother, letting them know if they have an open defects case, which comes with the baby born with NAS, if they have an open defects case, what to expect, and how to support the mothers through that defects case. And again, they continue to follow up with the mom afterwards too. And our coaches are back there at that table, so if you ever see them, they are my heroes. The work that they do every day just blows me away, the things that they see. And they continue to show up every day. And so here's some of the data that we have from that. We've seen about 110 mothers. And so in the beginning, the intent was to just see moms that had babies born with NAS, but we realized very quickly that if we can get to moms before they actually have the baby, then it could lessen the length of stay for the baby within the NICU, and then also provide support and make the chances of keeping the family together much higher. Because when mom's there, mom knows what to expect. She's a lot less likely to leave and run away out of shame and fear, and a lot more likely to be ready to dig down and do whatever it takes to take care of her family. So that was a brief overview of it, and if you have any questions, I'll be here later, but thank you guys.
Again, I'm Jay Parrish. I have the pleasure of serving as the Chief of Police here in Gainesville, and I have with me Investigator Brian Majors. He has been assigned for quite some time to our narcotics, multi-agency narcotics squad that we do with Hall County and some other agencies. And I know that some people assumed or thought when they saw our name on the program that we're going in here to talk about illegal and legal. Should we illegalize vapes, and should vape pens become illegal? That's not why we're here tonight. As police officers, we usually don't take sides. We let the legislative branch decide what should be legal and illegal, and then we enforce it. So what I do want to point out tonight, and Brian's going to do a real good job of it because he's been on hundreds and hundreds of search warrants, and what he's going to bring to you is real fact of what we're seeing today. Just to kind of give you a little bit of historical perspective, and vape pens have been around for a long, long time, many, many, many years. They've only recently become the popular thing to do. But when vape pens were first put on the market, it was an alternative for cigarette smokers. So, and if there's medical staff in here, you can have to crucify me after if I get this wrong, but basically, a doctor looked at it and said, we're going to have to choose the lesser of the two evils. If you're addicted to nicotine, here's the lesser. Cigarettes have tar, the smoke itself, the nicotine, all that stuff going into your lungs. Here's a better solution for getting the nicotine and maybe weaning yourself off of it. But as they made these vapes, they loaded them with more nicotine. And Brian's going to show you the process that you'll see that today's vapes are loaded with a lot more than nicotine, okay? So at this point, I can tell you this, if you choose to smoke as an adult, that's your choice. You have that choice, and it's America. you're going to die an early death of cardiovascular disease, a pulmonary disease, or cancer. That's just going to happen, okay? However, with vapes and these vape pens, we don't know all the poison that you're getting, so we don't know all that's going to happen. Yes, we had our second death, and that's so tragic. 20 in the United States right now. And I'm glad that we're ahead of Dr. Norton, because when he comes up, he's a phenomenal speaker to start with. But when he shows you what this stuff does to your body, I hope it scares you. Our idea tonight is that this series is not in my family. Brian and I are focused on the youth, okay? Adults that choose to do, that's your free choice. Today we're focusing on the youth. You know who else is focusing on the youth? The makers of these e-cigarettes. And I don't think you're going to doubt it when we're done. They didn't come onto the scene and say, hey, we're going to give cigarette smokers an alternative. They saw a target audience. Cigarette smokers, nicotine users, they are an audience. But they saw a target audience, and it was our youth, and they caught us with our guard down, and now it's the popular thing to do. It's easy to do. If you've seen people do it, they can take the puff of vape. If you light up a cigarette around me, I can probably smell it within 100 or 150 feet. A couple of weeks ago, I was in the drive-thru at Kroger, had my window down so I could exchange with a pharmacist. I smelled cigarette smoke just like that. I looked at the car behind me, their hands are on the steering wheel, they're not smoking. The car behind them, smoke's coming out the window. That's how far away I could smell it. Vape pens are different. If we brought a bag of marijuana and set it on that table, the 5 or 6 tables around it, you're going to smell it if you have normal senses. You'll smell that marijuana. THC in a vape pen, you're probably not going to smell it. You may get a faint hint, but nothing like the leafy substance. And so now that's going into our schools. They can go into the bathroom, the teacher walks out of the room to handle business or whatever, big puff of it, the cloud goes away in 10, 15 seconds, and I just got a complete cigarette pack full of nicotine into my body. Or, as Brian will show you, something else. So I'm going to turn this part of the presentation over to Brian. He'll show you some very scary pictures of what's out there. This is what we're seeing. This is here in Gainesville, Georgia. And then I'll come back up and close with some other stats and things that are going on.
The chief said, I'm Brian Majors with the Gainesville Police Department. I've been with Gainesville for almost 17 years, currently assigned to the Hall County Man's Unit. And in that Man's Unit, we investigate drug crimes. 5 years ago when I started at the Man's Unit, we almost never saw THC vials. We just saw the regular marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin. Now, today, every time we find drugs, we're finding the THC vials. It seems like everybody's using them. And what I find is a lot of times the people that we arrest with these THC vials don't really know what the ramifications of having those are versus marijuana. A user amount of marijuana in this leafy substance is a misdemeanor in the state of Georgia. But any quantity of THC oil minus the leafy material is a felony. And a misdemeanor is a crime where you're going to go to jail. You could possibly spend up to 12 months in jail, which you probably will not, and have a fine of about $1,000. Public intoxication is right in the same realm of a misdemeanor. It won't really affect your record all that much, but there is some exceptions to that when it comes to a drug misdemeanor. A felony, however, is a crime where you will spend more than a year in prison, and the fines are magnified significantly with felony offenses. But to go along with the felony conviction, there are restrictions on the rights of felons in the state of Georgia. And these are things that you lose when you become a felon. hold public office, serve on a jury, vote, have a gun, get public housing, and federal student aid are things that you will lose with drug offenses. And sometimes that does include the misdemeanor drug offenses as well. But certainly with felonies, you're going to lose these things. So I think it's important that we know, if you're looking for a little bit of THC, the THC vial will get you a felony at any amount. Even if the vial is what you would think empty with just a little bit of residual THC oil in it, that is enough to get you convicted of a felony in Georgia, and you forfeit all of this. So, these are pictures of what we typically see on the street of boxes. And I say the street, and also the schools, because the streets and the schools should be interchangeable in this context, because everything that we see on the streets, we see in the schools. And this product is obviously a medical treatment for a legitimate medical condition targeted to adults. Correct? No. It's obvious who they're looking for here. By the way, you'll see the Jelly Belly logo. They've changed the words just a little bit. There at the middle cart. That trademark is owned by the Jelly Belly Candy Company. Now these are some of the others we see that are not necessarily marketed to children, but this picture kind of gives you a better view of what that tube looks like when it's in its packaging. We see pretty much less of these. You know, this kind of has the look of a pack of cigarettes to me. We see them on occasion, but for the most part, they look like this. You know, to the far left, you'll see that there's South Park characters on these boxes. In the middle picture, you'll see an image of Betty Boop, who is a trademark of Paramount Pictures, and the Monopoly logo with the Monopoly Man up there, which is a trademark of Parker Brothers. And without changing any words or any logos, you see Honey Nut Cheerios and Cinnamon Toast Crunch, you know, trademarks of General Mills and Kellogg's. Here's some more General Mills and Kellogg's cereals. And let me say, these companies have absolutely nothing to do with this. They're not putting out these THC vials. They are, these companies are using their name in trademark infringement. Also notice that these vials does not have a brown liquid in them. That's important later, and I'll show you why. More cereal. Again, trademarked by General Mills and Kellogg's. There's our Captain Crunch with a THC vape vial inside, and that's an infringed trademark. And the reason I bring that up is because a trademark infringement typically runs hundreds of thousands to millions, depending on the damage done to the company who was infringed upon. So how could these companies making these THC vials afford to be in business and turn a profit knowing that they're about to have to pay the piper to the tune of over $1 million? And the answer is, they're not going to have to. These companies are clandestine, they're secret, they're under the table, and nobody can find them. They're not given permission, nor are they any way affiliated with any of the companies that I mentioned. So they're not worried about having to pay the millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars for the copyright infringement because they know they can't be found. Now, we're not here about copyright infringement. We're here about vape. So I say that to say this. If they're not worried about paying that money for the copyright infringement, they're certainly not worried about taking responsibility for the injury or death caused by the product. They can't be found. Now, this company, Supreme, that is the logo of Supreme New York, which is a clothing company, skateboarding company. And as far as I know, and I've done some research into the company, they do not make this, they do not approve this, they have nothing to do with this product that you're looking at. Now, I'm 41 years old. My wife is 31 years old. My oldest daughter is 22 years old. Now, before you get your forks and pitchforks out, my wife is not the biological mother of my oldest daughter. And then my wife has a sister who is 15 years old in high school. Now, my wife's sister and every one of her friends that I see have this sticker on their phone case or their backpack, or they might have a shirt that shows this logo. Like, it's a big deal with them. My daughter, 22, she's a student at University of North Georgia. She says her age group, she might see one or two people that wear this logo, but for the most part, she don't see it in people her age group. My wife says that she never sees anybody in her age group, and I certainly don't in my age group. Your experience with this company may differ, but that is just, in my family, what I have seen. So this product here is obviously targeting middle school to high school, because I'll tell you this, you could go to any middle school or high school in Hall County or probably the state of Georgia, and you can't walk through it without seeing this logo on one of the kids or some of their stuff. It's absolutely targeted for the adolescent. And I want to say again, Supreme New York does not make this. So when somebody's sick or dies from what happened, from what's in it, because who knows? Supreme New York's not paying for that. And we don't know who. I do have some clues as to who might be making them, but this is a company, Dank Vapes. We see this pretty much more than any other. On the boxes of the THC vials that we find, and they'll have some kind of graphic on it, and they'll have some kind of little description of what it is and what it tastes like, and then a THC content somewhere on the back, which is usually round about anywhere from 80 to 97% THC in the vial, according to the what's written there. There are other companies, and I use this one only as an example, and I won't use the rest of them just to save some time here, but this is what we find people using, is this and a few others, but mostly this brand, Dank Vapes. And they take this box and they open it up and they put this into their machine and they ingest this into their lungs, and they trust that it's what it says it is, the drug THC. But you can go right on the internet and buy the boxes that says what it is. Here's another example, and we could pull this up and we could probably go for the rest of the afternoon just showing you examples of the packaging that you can buy to package up your own vape. Here's another example with the tube. And then here's a big old pile of tubes that you can fill up. You can put sweat out of an old boot in there. You can put poison. You can put whatever you want. You package it, you sell it. Or, you know, we worry so much about school shootings these days. What about when the right psychopath decides to poison our children through their vape? It's, as you can see, this is Amazon even. As you can see, there are products out there so you can just build whatever you like. And the packaging says whatever you like, because it don't matter. Because what you're putting in there is what you're putting in there. So what is actually in it? Well, you're not going to know. When you put that vape to your lips and you inhale this substance into your lungs thinking it's nicotine or THC, you don't know, especially coming from these clandestine companies. But when we find these things, as we do with all drugs, we send them away to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's Department of Forensic Sciences crime lab. So I spoke with the crime lab about what are you seeing in Georgia in the vapes that we're sending in that we suspect are THC. And they said, well, we're seeing THC and nicotine. But in addition to that, there's several synthetic cannabinoids that they found in the vapes. There's kratom, CBD, and there's fentanyl. In 2017, fentanyl took the lives of 419 Georgians. And I don't have the numbers for 2018 or 19, but I'll take a bet with any of you that it's higher than that. None of these packages list kratom. They don't list synthetic cannabinoids, and they certainly don't list fentanyl. But they're there. When you vape these THC vials from these clandestine laboratories, you're literally taking your life into your own hands. Thank you for your time.
So kind of just to wrap up from a police department standpoint, and all these kind of scare you, but when he talks about fentanyl and the 400 and some odd deaths out of 1,000 Georgian deaths from opioids, take a 13-year-old middle school student. 13-year-old middle school student, never had an opioid in his or her life. They think that they're getting a vape and maybe hitting their first fun party hit of THC, and it's going to make you high and it's going to make you laugh or whatever. They're dead. Their body's not ready to withstand that. And it came in a box that said Captain Crunch, something they've been eating since they're 4 or 5 years old. Our point tonight is, again, adults, make whatever decision you want, purchase how you want. The biggest problem, and Deb hit on it, there's no regulatory agency controlling this stuff. And now that THC is legalized in several states, it makes getting these THC vials into Georgia very easy. It's coming through the mail, it's coming through courier services, and it's walking right into our streets and schools. And so now, without having that overpowering smell of marijuana, teenagers are able to put it in a vape, get a quick hit of it. To kind of finish with a story, when I first realized what the vaping trends and problems were, I got a text message from a close friend, and he told me the location he was at, and he said these two kids that he knew, and he knew they were 14 and 15, just purchased 2 Juuls. And I looked, and at first I thought he misspelled a word. And then he used it, he said this juuling has got out of control. And I'd never heard juuling as a verb. So I got to looking into it and realized what a Juul is. It's an e-cigarette. And it's a one-hit wonder, I call it. It's where they can get all that drug in one quick puff. And basically he was telling me where to go find these clandestine sales or underage sales, whatever else. That's when I got with Brian to say, hey, what are y'all seeing? If there's ever been a gateway drug for our kids, it's these vapes, all right? Because somehow it got labeled the cool thing to do. We showed you from the police department what's out there on the streets, how it's marketing. 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 now, I can't remember, but in September, Athens Clarke County Police Department did a raid and seizure in a basement, and the story's out there in the news, just Google it. I think they got 200 vape pens that were being made in a basement by a high school dropout that had no clue what he was putting in those. But he was making a killing by selling them back out onto the black market. And drugs were going into that, poison, all kinds of stuff. Whatever he could liquid put in there, that's what he was putting it, sending it out. That's what ends up in our home. So I'll end with this. I have a 14-year-old son. Parents, Adam's going to come up here and tell you how to have that conversation, and maybe this is just the penalty for having a dad as a cop. You got to get involved in your kid's life. My son came home one day and I had washed the sheets and made up his bed. He's like, thanks for cleaning up my room. And I'm like, guess what, Grayson? I cleaned it up because I tossed it first. What's toss it mean? That's what we do on a search warrant. I looked through every drawer, everything, your clothes, I went through it all. And I appreciate you being clean, son. And you're like, well, he's just going to take it with him. He's going to put it in his book bag, whatever. No. This is when he's playing basketball. This is when I know he's just outside. I want him to know I care. I made a lot of stupid decisions when I was young, and I want to be there so when he makes a stupid decision, I can correct it before it becomes a habit. The stats on kids that are addicted to nicotine from vape pens, have THC problems, hadn't even hit 20 years old, should scare us all to unite as a community and do something about it. If how they're marketing to our kids doesn't scare you, then Dr. Norton telling you what it's doing to our bodies, their bodies, will. So I'm not here to say legal or illegal. I want you to know the facts. I want you to know that these companies, that these people, that these pushers, they have no care about your family, but they have one market, and that's our teenagers. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Norton.
Y'all look pretty serious. Y'all gonna have to lighten up a little bit. I'm tired, and y'all gonna have to laugh at my jokes and put up with me for just a minute. Y'all are my 4th class today, so I'm going to try to give you some information that is important information having to do with the dangers of vaping. I have researched this information over the last 6 months, and being at the University of Georgia and teaching pharmacy students, med students, psychology students, you always have to go to evidence-based medicine, and there's always controversy about what happens and what's not. And the CDC is a very good organization, but they're very political, so they're hesitant to talk about actually what has happened in the lungs. So I'm going to try to give you some information about that. And I think it will be helpful information. Vaping has to do with the use of an inhalant. It is produced by an electronic apparatus, and there's the Juul, as the Chief and Brian talked about. The current information, and this was as of last week, as you notice, it's had 12 deaths as of this afternoon. According to the latest, they have been now reported 23 deaths. Let me tell you how the reporting's going to go. You're going to have hundreds of deaths. You're going to have hundreds of thousands of injuries in the lungs because the physicians and the people who've been treating these individuals had no clue what was going on, because a lot of the patients coming in would not tell them why and how they got the situation they were in. So these numbers are extremely low, and I anticipate as time goes on you will see increased numbers as we go through it. As Chief was talking about, 16% of this particular population of 805, it's now over 1,000, were under the age of 18. Now, in the developmental component of the lung is not fully mature until about 22 years old. So there's a process of expansion, especially in the small sacs, and the air sacs. And those sacs are extremely important for long-term life. And we've got to have appropriate amounts of oxygen that goes in. And so when you're having individuals who are beginning to use the vapes, as was adequately described, that they don't know what's in them, and we'll talk a little more about that, then there's a possibility of some serious problems. Now, CDC also has received data on substances used in e-cigarettes on vaping products in 30 days prior. So 77% that had some problems reported using THC-containing products. 36 reported exclusive use of THC-containing products. 50% didn't know what they were using. They thought it was THC, but as we just saw in a very graphic, it's synthetic THC, and that's different. That is much different and also much more damaging to the lung than a regular THC molecule. But the thing about it is, we see it. Also, 57% reported use of nicotine-containing products, and 16% exclusive use of nicotine-containing, and those are usually the Juuls. The Juuls is a concentrated apparatus that will take one cigarette, the concentration of nicotine in one cigarette, and by the time they inhale that first puff inside of a Juul, they've inhaled 10 cigarettes. So the nicotine concentration, so they get a real good buzz. And that's why the kids are using it. That's why the kids like it. It gives them a real good buzz. And it's one of those things that they don't realize the situation. But anyway, the specific chemical exposure that causing lung injuries associated with e-cigarettes remains unknown. And again, this is a CDC statement. They're being very cautious and being very aware. And I understand there's no single product or no single electronic product that has been currently identified as creating a problem. Even though we've got 23 deaths, we've got over 1,000 injuries that's been reported. Somebody's doing something, and so we're not getting as specific, but we will. And so we're going to have to do more research. Now, let's talk about what happens. Let's talk about vaping lung illness. They come in with common symptoms, according that's reported to the CDC. They suffer from respiratory problems, including coughing. The first thing that's going to happen when someone is having a developmental lung issue, the first thing that's going to happen, it's just like a cold. You're going to get a cough. And why does the lungs cough? The cough is to inhale, inhale, inhale in order that you get enough oxygen to function. And so you and the more you cough, actually what happens, it's paradoxical, you get less oxygen. But the first thing that you will see is a cough. The second thing that they will report is a shortness of breath. I happened to be talking to 3 of my students this afternoon, telling them that I was going to come up here and do a vaping talk. And they said, vaping talk? What about vaping? And so we have this conversation that I'm having with you. Come to find out they all 3 vape. And one of the things I told them is, if you have a cough, and you have shortness of breath, you already have started to damage your lungs. And all 3 of them reported that. And these are 22, 23-year-old young men. But the thing about it is, it starts out with that, and then as it worsens, depending on the damage of the part of the lung, lower part of the lung first, and then that goes up into the lung, very similar to if any of y'all had pneumonia, always starts in the lower part of the lung and goes up. The thing about it is, you start to have chest pains. And then when you have chest pains, and then if that continues, then you will begin to have a shortness of breath and a difficulty in breathing because the diaphragm can't push hard enough on the lung to get you enough oxygen to function. And so what happens is you have collapses. What happens with these individuals that are in stage lung disease that we're talking about that eventually die or at that particular point? How long does that take, Meryl? You will see symptoms within 2 weeks. It can get very worse in 6 weeks, depending on how often and how many times you vape per day and what you're vaping. And so the thing about it is, it ends up on a lung x-ray, the lungs appear to be inflamed. What you're doing with these unknown entities that they are inhaling is scalding the lungs. If you don't know what a scalded lung is, have you ever inhaled ammonia? If you've ever inhaled ammonia and you get that, that's what's happening. But it's what we call a cool vape. It is not aromatic enough to create sensories in the nose, but it does the same thing in the lung. And so it's very subtle. That's what I call this. This is what I call a silent killer. because it doesn't have the obvious problems with people, and that's why they're using it. But the thing about it is, you will have that inflamed, and the pathogen infected may or may not. You may develop a pneumonia and you may not. I'll get to that in a minute. But on the x-ray, it's inflamed. The doctors have tried to come up with a common bacterial or viral source of disease. They have failed to turn up anything, so you may have a negative smear. Again, the patients have only vaping in common, but no specific products are linked. Without a true diagnosis, the vaping illness is difficult to treat. The current way that you treat an inflamed tissue is with steroids. And so they will give you IV steroids, they'll calm that inflammation down, and the acute inflammation is managed with steroids. Once that acute inflammation has become chronic and it hardens the tissue inside the bronchiole, there is no return. That is irreparable lung damage. It does not get better with time. It gets worse with time. And I tell people this all the time: you're stupid to vape. If you don't know that, just keep doing it for another year or two, and you're going to be rolling around with an oxygen tank tied to you and you're 26, 27 years old, because the lung tissue is one of the most vulnerable tissues we have in our bodies. But the thing about it is, they can't find a diagnosis. They may or may not be able to treat it with steroids. They will give everybody oxygen. Most people go on respirators. And if you're healthy enough and you're not as damaged, then they can get that lung to respond naturally, and then they will release you, but you're going to have kind of like an asthmatic response. You're going to have a that doesn't get better with time. Other medical concerns include the different issues. The white blood cells inside of the lung get frozen. And what those white blood cells are, they will take particles and contaminants that we breathe in, like we're burning leaves or we're around something, we get stuff into the lung. They will actually attack those and destroy them and remove them so that we don't get infections. But when you're vaping, you freeze those white blood cells, and so that particle gets entrapped into the tissue in part of the lung, and guess what? You get very vulnerable to any type of infection, pneumonia, whatever. We also have explosions. I think there was someone that told me this afternoon, there was one here locally, where you actually put a pin up and it will blow up in your mouth. And we have a lot of those happen. This type of clandestine equipment, and that's what the chief is talking about, it's not quality assured. We have the big companies, Juul and others, that claim that they have quality assurance, but there's no guarantee. It's kind of like the battery in your phone. Y'all remember how much problems we got with the batteries, and y'all told you can't even carry your computers and the batteries on the airplane because of the scare of them exploding. Same battery being used in electronic cigarettes. So you also, and I don't have time to talk about the cardiotoxicity issue. Cardiotoxicity is where the lining around the cardiac muscle gets inflamed, very similar to what it does in the lung. And so not only do you have problems with breathing, you also have problems with your heart rate, and that's when we end up with some very serious medical issues. So what is vaping? It's acting of a vapor produced by any kind of e-cigarette or a personal vaporizer. They have been around since 1955. They were actually developed in 1893. So there's a long history, but no, a lot of people didn't use them because they were not something that they thought were good. We'd rather just smoke a cigarette instead of a vape. But the thing about it is, it isn't. Users load the liquids containing their drug into the device, and I'll show you that in a second. They draw on the device, the battery heats the liquid, and then it's analyzed. In other words, it turns it into these small molecules that they inhale, and that's what you see: inhale and then exhale. That big, it looks like vapor. But those are, and also if there's certain polymers that's inside of this vape, those polymers we also have discovered in the lung injury actually can coat certain parts of that lung, like you paint the wall. And if they use a certain clandestine vape with that type of polymer in it, it will simply coat the lung, and people simply will smother to death because they cannot breathe. This is the stuff that we're seeing on the streets that are coming to people with this. Electronic cigarettes, they're e-devices, e-pens, e-hookahs, hookah pens, vape pipes, vape pens, vaporizers, all of that. And that's kind of what. And this is kind of the ingredients. You have a vegetable oil, you have polyethylene glycol, antifreeze, believe it or not. Yes, that's right. That is antifreeze that you take in as a part of the vape. It's water vapor. It's BS is what it is. And then you have the flavorants. And in the flavorants, you have aldehydes, and aldehydes are similar to acids. They are one cousin from an acid, and one of the ones that they use in the flavoring agents is diacetyl. Now, diacetyl is a common combination of a flavoring compound that we put in bubble gum, we put in Jelly Bellies, we put in all types of things that we flavor, especially where there's multiple, hundreds of flavors. We anticipate in the flavoring industry, they have over 1,000 different flavors that contain diacetyl and its first and second cousins. Then we have palladium and nickel, and then we have a high-dose alkaline, which high-dose alkaline is a part of the inhalants, and we'll talk about the popcorn lung in just a minute. But as a part of that, these are all different components inside of this vape, besides the active ingredient, if it be nicotine, if it be THC, if it be some herbal, St. John's wort. I mean, they've got all these different things that they use, but these are part of the compounds that are inside that makes that vapor. It makes it atom. It makes them into that small molecules. This is what you have to do to make it. And so the teens don't call them e-cigarettes. They call them cartridges, water pipe, vape pipe, Juuls, and these are all some of the similars. And again, you can hook them up to your computer, you can plug them into the wall, you can do all kinds. Very similar to what you do with your phone. Very similar to what you do with your phone. Here's some others that you can do. But they also have those that are hidden. They've got some that look like backpacks. They got some that have little hooks to the head. They got all kinds of things that you can camouflage, especially underage individuals can camouflage so people wouldn't obviously know that they have a vape pen. It looks like something else, but it's not. The Juul, again, is very specific. It's very concentrated. All Juuls have nicotine, and you can add a different vapor to it, but they all contain nicotine. And again, they are kind of vaporless in the way that they are developed. These are, again, what we all just talked about, all the different things. Now, you have to understand, I'm trained as a medication safety expert. So if you come to my pharmacy, and you ask me about aspirin, I'm going to give you aspirin. I'm going to tell you it's got 325 milligrams, it's got 81 milligrams, it's got 500 milligrams, acetaminophen, whatever, and I'm going to be assured that that's what you're going to get. It's also, I can't sell anything out of my pharmacy unless it's got a certain amount of label or information, especially if it's an over-the-counter medication that is required by federal law that has to be on that package. Otherwise, I can't sell it. Do you understand? What do you see on these? Because they are not marketed to adults. They are marketed to adolescents. And that's what it's a curiosity, y'all. The reason that they are doing Captain Crunch and all of the things with South Park, because it's a curiosity. It's just to get them involved with it. Now, e-juice, again, I could list all of the different types of ingredients. Really don't have time to do that. But there are allergies to a lot of these, and people are having allergic responses very similar to what we see with penicillin. They are having allergic responses to the ingredients inside of the vape besides the damage to the lungs. So we got a complicating factor. And what happens is, it says that it can irritate the lungs, eyes, and may be more harmful to people who already have had chronic diseases, such as individuals who suffer from asthma. So you can imagine an adolescent asthmatic that's been on an inhaler, then starts to vape, creates further problems with the lung, and then what we'll eventually end up with is the process called emphysema. And emphysema is usually seen in long-term smokers after 40 plus years. Vapors will see it within less than 5 to 6 years. It is not going to be reversible. And there's no current treatment that is so new to medicine. We're really scratching our heads. How are we going to manage these people besides what I've already told you? It is a really difficult issue. The FDA generally reviews these as safe in foods, drugs, and cosmetics, but have not had any significant scientific studies done on what the impact of inhaling these particular compounds do. And what I sent a letter to the FDA about is, if that is the case, why did you allow these to come on the market? And the response is, we really didn't allow them to come on the market. They were on the market, and then we got called to come investigate them. Another political shell game, so to speak. So anyway, so we have e-vape, and then we have, again, all of these, and it's not just nicotine or THC, it's the flavoring agents. It is the other compounds that are included that create the vape, and then we add other substances such as hash oil, CBD, other types of things that people add clandestinely to the vape, and then you have that. The e-liquids, they will tell you there's commercially refillable e-liquids that you can purchase, is what we've talked about here. There's commercially non-refillable e-liquids that you can buy one time only. And then most of them are homemade or street sources because there's no regulation, y'all. There's no really regulation. Now, not all of it has to do with the equipment, though. A lot of it may be, we have people called hacking. They modify the device in a way that's not intended by the manufacturer. They refill, as we said earlier, where we have those empty cartridges, they simply refill those single cartridges with whatever they want. And we have what we call dripping, dropping a liquid directly onto the device heating coil to obtain a higher compound concentration in the inhalants. And that's where we usually see the problems with the explosions, is when they hit that hot coil with that cold solution, it will usually blow up. Then we have dabbing, which is superheated substances containing high concentrations of THC and other cannabinoids, and it's called butter, BHO, 710 CBD. It's not just water vapor, just like we said. If we look at the vapor and you look at all the different compounds that at least has been put together by several of the federal agencies, you will see some of the most formaldehyde, acetaldehyde, toluene, some of the most arsenic, cobalt, nickel. These things are horrendous. Talking about cancer-causing components, you have those. And not only do you have them vaporized. They're not just molecules, they are small molecules that are being held in some of the softest tissue in the body and being absorbed through that wall into the body. And what we're going to see is, I anticipate, a significant increase in various types of cancers as a result of some of this. The FDA has warned, though, e-cigarettes contain increased nicotine addiction, and also they can be toxic to humans. So the FDA seems to put itself off of that as a result of that, but that's one of the things. Now, what do we know about the vapor is that e-cigarettes, they exhale. Passive vaping is like secondhand smoke. So even though you're around and you're not vaping yourself, and they exhale they're exhaling that vapor, and you inhale it, that's like secondhand smoke. So you inhaling the same thing as the original smoker. So you have that, as we've talked about. So let's talk about the long-term effects. Popcorn lung is a popular term that came out of the food industry. We have known about a particular chemical, diacetyl, for 15, 16, 17 years. The reason I'm familiar with it because I'm a forensic pharmacist, and many years ago I had a call, I didn't take the case, but I had a call from a lawyer who had some individuals in the food industry, the popcorn industry, that were actually flavoring popcorn back when that was something they were trying to do. They were going to make it, cherry flavored and chocolate flavored and all these little flavors that they make. And the flavorings themselves, as long as they could take them orally, are benign. But what was happening is they were putting it in popcorn, heating the popcorn, which vaporized the flavoring agent, and people were developing lung issues as a result, and they couldn't understand what it was. Well, come to find out, after much research and several lawsuits, they found out that diacetyl became very hazardous when it was turned into a vapor, and it created a disease called bronchitis obliterans. What it means is to obliterate the bronchiole. That is what it does. The bronchiole, which I will show you a picture in a minute, is the small air sacs that are all over your lung tissue. And they're responsible for the transfer of oxygen that you breathe into your bloodstream. They're extremely important. They are very vulnerable to lots of things. But what happens is when you inhale this diacetyl and several other components, then you have problems. And so the food industry discovered it and said, stop. So they stopped putting diacetyl or using flavoring agents that had diacetyl in it 10, 12 years ago. Then we had coffee. How many of y'all like coffee? I'm needing a bad cup right now. So I need a Starbucks fast double shot. And y'all like mocha, and y'all like coconut, and y'all like all them little fancy, pumpkin is very popular now, right? All right. So the problem is, the coffee industry did the same thing. They started to flavor the coffees. They started to heat it up in order to cook it into the bean, and guess what happened? It vaporized, and people in the coffee industry, employees in the coffee industry, began to develop, guess what? The same kind of issue that the popcorn industry had had several years previous. So the flavoring folks said what? Stop. And then here we have vape. Over 1,000 flavoring agents contain diacetyl. And based on what you heard from the streets, from the chief and his investigator, what do you think's in it? So let's look at it. So diacetyl is a part of it, and it was part of the buttery chemical. And like I say, the flavoring industry estimates over 1,000 flavoring ingredients have the potential to be respiratory hazards due to the possible availability and irritant properties, and it has to do with all these different chemical compounds that are similar to diacetyl. So they say, I don't have diacetyl in it. Fine, let's see what you do have in it. But I guarantee you, you're going to have an aldehyde in it, because I'm an organic chemistry major, and you're going to have aldehydes in it in order for it to vaporize, in order for it to work. Do you understand? Flavoring is a part of how they get that to vaporize, and when it vaporizes, guess what? It releases other aldehydes, ketones, and that's why I tell you the numbers are going to increase significantly over the next year or so that will be reported as a result of that. So what happens, Meryl? Here's your normal lung, and here's your bronchioles, and here's your little air sacs, alveoli. And so what you have here is these very tender, and they look just like this, very healthy. Air comes in, transfers into those small capillaries, that converts into that alveoli, and it puts it into the bloodstream, and we breathe, and we walk, and we talk, and we do all those things. Wonderful way to do this. But the normal lung is split up into a branch, as left and a right branch. You have a primary bronchus, you have a secondary bronchus, you have a bronchiole, and inside of that bronchiole you have the air sacs. Look just like this. They look like there's millions of them. And if you look at the diameter of these air sacs, and I don't have, sorry the slide is not big enough, you see they get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller because they have to be so small. They have to take a molecule of oxygen and be able to take that molecule of oxygen and put it into the bloodstream. Do you understand? It has to be smaller and smaller. The first area of this lung that is damaged is what? The air sacs. You stop and bronch up the air sacs, you stop being able to convert and transfer oxygen from respiratory oxygen into blood oxygen, and guess what? The body starts not having enough oxygen to function, and that's when it starts coughing. Because it's trying to get oxygen. That's what the cough is for. It's also to clear the mucus and the materials out of the bronchiole in order to do that. But guess what? As this continues, you can develop two types of this bronchitis oblivions. One is constrictive, which means they get smaller, the airways get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you can have one that also has pneumonia attached to it, and that creates tremendous amounts of fluid and mucus and around, and it covers what little small air passage you have, and so guess what? You can't breathe at all. So they put you on a respirator. Now, symptoms of bronchial obstruction generally develop over 2 to 8 weeks after exposure to toxic fumes or respiratory illness. Asbestos, ammonia, mustard gas, Ladies and gentlemen, I'm comparing your vapes that's out here on the streets and some that are theoretically been evaluated by the manufacturers similar to those compounds. And what really irritates me about this is that most people, as I did, when these first came out, thought, oh my goodness, we've got an alternative to nicotine and cigarettes, right? We got an alternative. Well, we were bamboozled. We were flat out lied to. And I don't know about you, I don't like people lying to me. And I have people sometimes get up in my face and they're selling vapes and they're vaping and they got their, and I'm like the chief. It is your right to die early. That is your right. But that better not cost me a dime. You better cover your own insurance. You better take care of your own hospital bills. You better do the things you're supposed to do, because then you don't have any defense. Because what happens, these chronic illnesses becoming chronic disabilities, these people can't function. And I cannot see that. I do not understand. This normally is seen, by the way, in medicine as a result of lung transplants. 55% of people who get a lung transplant develop this type of process because of a rejection. It's a very serious thing because those people eventually go on to die. That's why lung transplants are working, but they're not. But the other problem is irritant substance. So if you want to know what happens, and I've got my time's up. I'm over time actually. You got the normal airway, looks like this, and then in 6-8 weeks, it can begin to close this airway such as this with airway injury. You punch holes in the airway and put dots in it. It starts to inflame. And then what happens, y'all, it starts to scar. And when it starts to scar, then that's when the permanent damage occurs. If you continue, guess what? That 3 centimeter, 1.5 centimeter, 1/4 centimeter, that's all the air passage you have to breathe. And ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you that is simply a slide on COPD. And that is what is so disturbing about this. But again, you have these compounds, and there's hundreds of them. There's not just diacetyl, there's hundreds of them that are in the vapes in order for them to become atomized so that they can be what we call a vapor, and that's what most people don't understand. So you have these different types of bronchitis. You have the air cells. You have, again, a bigger picture. This is what a normal bronchiole should look like, and this is what it happens when you have bronchitis ebullient, and you see the difference. And what I want to tell you is nothing in medicine can take this back to this. Nothing outside of a lung transplant. And this is popcorn lung, y'all. With that and that type of restriction inside of the lung shrinks and it shapes up very similar to a little kidney peel here. And you see how this lung has lost 60% of its capacity. This lung has lost 40% of its capacity. And so guess what? You're on a breathing machine, you're on oxygen just to walk down to the door. And so, and this is what I say, what is the disconnect? And I throw this in because most people don't know this. Large amounts of nicotine are lethal. 60 milligrams in adults and 6 milligrams in children. That's all it takes to kill somebody. We use nicotine as pesticides. Y'all know that, don't you? We use it as a pesticide. Nicotine is an insecticide, a toxin. Number of poisonings linked to e-cigarettes, liquids, was 1,351 in 2013, which was a 300% increase from 2012, and it's gone higher than that, but I haven't got that statistic. Nicotine poisoning is also a part of this whole issue of vaping. So you look at the examining and striking similarities to gene mutation in lung cells. So what happens found in smokers? So what happens with that if you want to know the genetic mutations? A vapor may have a natural healthy lung as he begins to smoke or she begins to smoke, and she changes the gene code. She gets pregnant, and guess what? The child will have a weaker lung system as a result and can have that pass from generation to generation to generation. That's how dangerous this stuff is. That's why I'm up here tonight. If I didn't think it was dangerous, and if I didn't think it was safe, I wouldn't be here. But the thing about it is, it's extremely dangerous. Vape, as most people say, they see it. Here's your resources. Like I say, these are things that we can give you, and then we'll have conversation. I'll turn it over to Adam, and he will tell you how to have that conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, I recognize I'm standing between you and the end of this presentation, so we're going to get through this pretty quickly. I'm Adam Rollerson, and I work at Laurelwood. I am a marriage and family therapist, so I have the pleasure of being here tonight to talk about, with all this information that we've heard, what do we do with it? How do we have these difficult conversations? So we're going to get to that. We're going to talk about how to have the conversations. We're going to go over a couple of communication skills that may help us in these conversations. But before we do, we have the pleasure of just having a conversation with one of our young folks. Angie is part of our Gainesville PD Explorer program, and she is also a senior at Gainesville High School. And she has graciously volunteered to just talk to us a little bit tonight about what her experience has been. So with that, we're going to have a little conversation. Let me have this. Okay. Y'all can hear me okay with this? All right, great. So, Angie, first of all, thank you for being up here.
For having me.
Absolutely. So, first thing we want to ask, Angie, is we've heard a lot of information tonight about vaping. And so I want to know, what are you seeing amongst your peers that's related to vaping?
Well, usually I'm seeing most of my peers walk out of class, go to the restroom, and apparently start vaping. Sorry. Another thing is that they start vaping in class while the teacher is probably, distracted teaching. They do it out of nowhere, and it's pretty sad, actually. It's like, yeah.
Okay. All right. What did you hear tonight in the presentations that surprised you?
A lot of things. Mostly what it does to our lungs, and how teenagers don't really see, the consequences that vaping brings.
You know anybody personally that's vaping?
Yes.
Yes? What concerns do you have about someone that you know is vaping?
Mostly that they're getting caught up in vaping and start failing classes, they stop showing up, they start skipping, and their grades go down.
Last question. In just a few minutes, we're going to go over the importance of having conversations about this topic, vaping, and other, very important topics. We're going to talk about a few tips to make those conversations go better. Why do you think it's important that we have these types of conversations?
To bring light to the situation, mostly. Teenagers don't really see, I guess they don't think about what they do. And it's important to talk about it because most kids don't know about it. And they're just, I guess they do it for fun, they don't know what they're doing. That's, I guess, yeah.
Okay, and so with that said, from your perspective, what can we do better? And when I say we, I'm talking about the adults. What can we as adults do better when it comes to having these types of conversations?
Mostly don't make your kids feel attacked, I guess, about what they do. Instead of that, just talk to them, try to understand them, try to understand why they do what they do.
Now, those are all the questions I have. Is there anything else you'd like to say? No? Okay, Angie, thank you so much. I really appreciate Angie taking the time to come up here. You know, it's pretty intimidating to be a high school senior and stand in front of all of you. So again, Angie, thank you for doing that. So what we want to talk about tonight, and just to give you a little backdrop, when we were talking about this forum and what we wanted to cover, you know, one thing I mentioned in that meeting, from my perspective in working with families, is we have all these very important things going on, serious things going on with our youth, whether it's vaping, other drug use, suicide. And what I've found is so many families have kind of lost the art of talking because we're all so focused on texting and doing this. Now, show of hands, who in here has ever texted a family member, in the next room over in your house? If you didn't raise your hand, you're probably lying. So I made a comment in that meeting that, you know, I think families, we don't know how to have these difficult conversations. And I had a great friend in that meeting say, you know, I think it's a great idea. Why don't you talk about that in the forum? So I'm very appreciative of being volunteered to do that. But we are seeing that with our families. At least I am. I've been in practice in this community for 17 years. And over time, what I've noticed is parents, especially, just aren't ready to have conversations. They may think something's going on with their youth, but they're just not having those conversations. So what's keeping us from having those conversations? When I talk to families, first thing I hear usually is we're extremely busy. We have a very busy schedule. We're running around in activities. As long as they're doing okay in activities, no need to have one of these conversations. Or I don't really know how to start the conversation. So as long as everybody's good, we won't talk about it. The other thing we hear is it may lead to conflict or more conflict. You know, a lot of families try to talk about what's going on and they have a big blow up, have a big argument. And so why keep trying to have that conversation? The last thing is, I summarize all that by fear. You know, we're afraid to have these difficult conversations. Now, I am a trained professional and I've helped hundreds of families over the years. So I'm an expert when it comes to helping you have those conversations in your family. I have a 14-year-old son, and I struggle every day with having difficult conversations with him because we tend to do this. Anybody can relate to that, right? And so he knows everything. I'm old, and so anytime I try to talk to him, he makes it real clear that I don't really know what I'm talking about. Go help another family. So I summarize it by fear. Well, what are we afraid of? What I hear is that we're afraid of the unknown. I don't know what my kid's doing. I don't want to know what my kid's doing. So I just don't have that conversation. Some of us are afraid because we have a lack of information. Anybody in here learn anything about vaping tonight that you didn't know before? I learned a lot, and I've been practicing in this field. So sometimes we don't want to have conversations because we don't know what to talk about. What about a fear of conflict? We already talked about that. What I hear, especially around suicide, parents don't want to talk to their kids about suicide, especially, is the fear of the answer. What happens if I find out my child's been thinking about suicide? What happens if I find out they've been vaping? And then what happens next? Okay, now I know they're vaping. What do I do? Well, how do I get help? From my perspective, what if we thought about fear a little bit differently? What if we thought about fear and we used that acrostic right there as saying forming engaged, authentic relationships? What if we did that? What if we used that fear that we have, that concern that we have about how the conversation may go, what if we use that to motivate us and propel us to actually start the conversations? How do we even do that? You know, what does that mean? So I came up with just a simple 4-step process. And believe me, this is very simple. All of us can do this. I try to do this a lot. That's not good. Okay, here we go. Step 1. Just 4 steps. We got to make it happen. The goal of this step is to actually start a conversation. So that fear we talked about, how do we cast that aside long enough to make a decision to act? how does the anxiety we have about what might be going on with our child get to a point where we're tired of wondering and we actually start to have the conversation? We got to make time. We're all very busy. We got a lot of activities going on, but I guarantee you if your child's involved in sports or any sort of extracurricular activities, you make a point to get them there. So we're just going to have to make the time. And we're talking about vaping, and a lot of this is parent to child interaction, adult to child interaction, but this could be anybody. This could be your coworkers, family member that you're concerned about. The last thing in this step is have a plan in mind. Don't just wing it. Every time you try to wing it, every time I try to wing it, we mess it up. So actually have a plan in mind. And we're going to talk about how to develop a plan in just a second. The second step is to make it real. And the goal here is to open up the dialogue. I hear this quote all the time. I've heard it from pastors, I've heard it from teachers, coaches, motivational speakers. If someone can tell me where this quote originated, let me know and I will reference that in future presentations. I've heard it so much, I don't know who said it. The quote, people don't care how much you know. They want to know how much you care. And Angie, what she said, I thought was great, because a lot of times, especially as parents, we don't necessarily convey that we care. It's a lot of punitive conversation most of the time. And so our young people, they don't really care how much we know. They don't want to know all the statistics all the time. Statistics are good, and they need to hear some of this data we heard tonight, what's happening to them. But they also need to hear that you care. So acknowledge your fear. It's perfectly okay to say, I'm worried about how this conversation will go. I'm nervous about having this conversation. I don't know a lot about vaping, but I want to know what's going on with you. Avoid lecturing or giving commands or ultimatums, right? Nobody likes to be lectured. Seek to understand and demonstrate a strong desire to be supportive and helpful. And use simple tools to change your communication pattern. A lot of families I work with, they get stuck in a pattern of communication where it always ends up in a blow-up arguments, door slamming, sometimes physical altercations, and so that's their pattern. Happens every time. So how do we change that pattern in families? We're going to talk about 2 skills tonight, active listening and I statements. And the whole point of those skills are to reduce defensiveness. I statements are wonderful for reducing defensiveness in the person that you're talking to. Third step, we want to make it meaningful. And the goal here is to reinforce the positive. Now this step is extremely important because you want the conversation to be productive. You want it to be effective. So you got to pay close attention for any sort of victory in the conversation. So if as soon as you bring up vaping, your child, your student throws their hands up, runs out the door, but this time you brought up vaping and they kind of hung in there, that's a victory. You got to celebrate that somehow. You always want to end the conversation on a good note. Be thankful for the conversation, for the fact that you were able to sit down and have that conversation. Express things. Make sure the person you're talking to understands that you appreciate the fact that they were willing to try this conversation, and celebrate. It doesn't have to be anything great, but if you're used to fighting all the time and never having a productive conversation, and all of a sudden you can get there, go out and celebrate. It will mean a lot to the young folks. And then the last step, make it routine. We have to agree to continue the conversation. This doesn't happen overnight. We have to set aside time within our families to spend time together without our electronic devices. And a lot of times families have to establish a set time during the week, a schedule, because there's so many activities that you're going to. You want to develop communication skills. There's so much information on communication and how to be an effective listener. You can find any of that. You don't have to go to a trained professional. I like it when you do, but you don't have to. And then create a family routine or ritual. This is extremely easy to do once you start having some of these difficult conversations, you start having some success, and it makes it easier to have the conversations, because when we have close relationships, it allows us to have the freedom to say what we really want to say. If young people trust that we're not going to judge them or yell at them or criticize them, and we're just going to show support, then I think they're going to be much more willing to have those conversations with us. So, those are the 4 steps. Nothing dramatic, nothing too serious, nothing too difficult. When we talk about I statements, now in your packet, everybody has a copy of I statements and a copy of active listening, which we're going to talk about. So you have information to go out with you. But I statements are simply this: I feel whatever the emotion is when this event happens, because this is what I thought about the event. And then you finish it with, I want what you want to happen instead. So the example I gave, specific to vaping, so this would be a parent. Rather than yelling at your kid about, you're never going to vape again, you're grounded for 3 months, there's a place for that. But when you're trying to generate some authentic communication and conversations, this is how that I statement would go. I felt scared when I found out that you were vaping because I worry it might hurt you. And based on what we learned tonight, we should all have that fear. But do we convey that to our young people? I want to know that you are safe. Completely different message than you're not going to vape anymore because you shouldn't be doing that anyway. You're hurting yourself. And if I catch you doing it again, this is what's going to happen. Again, there's a place for that, but not when we're trying to open up the dialogue. Now, this would be a young person. I had a different word for emotion, and I was told to change it. You know, most kids are going to be a little more, especially adolescents, they're going to be a little more explicit in their language most of the time. But we'll go with this. I feel ticked when everyone yells at me about smoking because I'm not hurting anybody. I want people to trust me more. I hear that over and over with adolescents especially. You know, the goal of adolescence is to start to develop some independence, prepare for adulthood. That's the youth's goal. They want to become more independent. That's our goal as parents as well. We want them to become more independent. So we have the same goal. We just tend to have a different idea of how to get there, right? And so that's how we use I statements. Active listening. On your table you have a packet of information and it says talk, they will listen. Well, if you listen, they will talk. Problem is, we're not usually good listeners. We're so focused on what we're going to say that we're not good listeners. And that's true with parent-child relationships, any married folks in the house. That's true with spousal relationships. And so we've got to learn the art of listening again. So active listening is a great way to do this. You got to pay attention. So you can't be on your electronic device. You got to show that you're listening, so you got to make eye contact, nod your head every once in a while, right? Provide some feedback. So what I heard you say is you feel ticked when we get on to you about smoking. I can see that. You'd like me to trust you more. I can see that. Deferred judgment. Now, what does this mean? This means let's just withhold your personal opinions for the moment, right, while we're having this conversation. And that can be verbal, you know, your verbal communication of, well, that's just the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Okay, that's a little bit judgmental. Rolling your eyes, shaking your head, doing the finger wave, whatever it is. Defer judgment, if only for that moment. There will be a time where you can share your opinion, but while the youth is talking, or your coworker or your spouse, defer judgment for a brief moment. And then respond appropriately. You know, if you're getting information, especially parents, if we get information about something that's going on, hey, thank you for telling me that you've been vaping. You lost the car for 6 months. I mean, that would not be an appropriate response, because what does that teach the youth? I'm not telling you anything else, right? So those are the 2 skills that we wanted to talk about. Now, what we're going to do next for the next several minutes is we're going to have a small group discussion. We're going to go over these I statements. We're going to talk about active listening. It's an opportunity for you all to kind of share your thoughts, what you've learned. Before you leave tonight, if possible, we want you to walk away with a conversation plan. So you've heard a lot of information. You understand just how serious vaping is. My guess is that you want to have some conversations about that with your loved one who may be vaping. So you have in your packet, you have a conversation plan, and that's there so we can help you to kind of map that out. So we want you to take action.